Mr. Rogers is a man who has brought joy to children for multiple generations. His name is synonymous with families and happiness and wholesomeness. Is it also possible that this man is responsible for the zombie apocalypse? The answer is, yeah, he totally is. Let's get into it. First up, unlike werewolves, vampires, and ghosts, the monsters that we call zombies that fill our movies, TV shows, video games, and more, those are a fairly recent creation. The idea of undead monsters goes back as far as written history. And the word zombie has been around for a while. It's a Haitian word and was often tied to magic and voodoo. But the monsters that we call zombies now, the flesh-eating mindless hordes, the ones that bite you and can turn you into one of them, that all can be traced back to George Romero's 1968 film, Night of the Living Dead. This film spawned not only a genre, but arguably the most culturally significant monster the world has ever seen. Thanks to the era of shared media, the entire world can be scared of the same thing at once. If you can throw a dart at a map, I bet you there is a zombie film to come out of that part of the world. The modern zombie transcends not only borders, but also mediums and genres. Anything you can think of has had a zombie in it or on it or around it. Video games, movies, television shows, action figures, t-shirts, ketchup is a popular thing, zombie ketchup. I have had zombie ketchup. It tastes like ketchup. But where did writer-director George Romero, along with co-writer Jack Russo, first come up with the idea for the modern zombie? Mr. Romero has said in interviews that the monster hordes in Richard Matheson's 1954 novel, I Am Legend, has been one of the original points of his inspiration. In fact, Hollywood has adapted I Am Legend to several movies, The Last Man on Earth, The Omega Man, and Will Smith's 2007 I Am Legend. And it's totally true. Scenes from I Am Legend should feel familiar to fans of zombie movies. Groups of unrelenting monsters trying to break into a house. It's very Night of the Living Dead.
Richard actually jokes with me about saying that I stole his idea. And I keep saying, no, my guys aren't vampires. They certainly aren't vampires.
The monsters in I Am Legend are very much classic vampires. Pale, blood-sucking, nocturnal, and they can be defeated with mirrors, garlic, and crucifixes. It's a great story, and maybe someday Hollywood will get it right if they actually stick to the original ending, but I digress. In Night of the Living Dead, the monsters themselves, the actual zombies, are a complete original creation of writer-director George Romero and co-writer Jack Russo, and set the stage for everything that we would call a zombie after. As a young man out of college, Romero honed his skills and learned and collaborated with none other than Mr. Rogers. The two men actually collaborated on over a dozen short films together.
I did Mr. Rogers Gets a Tonsillectomy. To this day, the scariest film I ever made.
Romero is quoted saying, I still joke that Mr. Rogers Gets a Tonsillectomy is the scariest film I've ever made. What I really mean is that I was scared shitless when I was trying to pull it off. It was his first film.
I loved Fred. I used to shoot he had this feature on his program called Picture Picture. Mm-hmm. And the trolley would come and take us off to someplace, some other land. And we would, I shot all the picture things for Fred. Most of the people that are working professionals in media today, all of us started with Fred. And he was the first guy that really sort of let me, have final cut and trusted me enough to do that.
He watched Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. I think he just honestly enjoyed them, or could appreciate them for what they were. He's just a very supportive guy.
George is said to have written the script for Night of the Living Dead while working on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He had even intended to cast Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood actors as the stars of the horror film. I originally wanted a local actress named Betty Aberlin, who is Lady Aberlin on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, in the role of Barbara in Night of the Living Dead. But Fred put his foot down and said no. This is of note in that this is the only time that Mr. Rogers ever objected to any of Romero's zombie films. IFC and other online sources go so far as to say that Mr. Rogers himself is the original inspiration for the zombie. That when he was drugged and coming out of anesthesia and kind of lumbering back to life, that was the original inspiration. While that's plausible, I could not actually find any evidence of this from any quotes from either Mr. Rogers or George Romero. It's a fun idea. What we do know for sure is that Mr. Rogers absolutely did give George Romero his first big break, and that he continued to help him and mentor him. And it is very possible, in fact likely, that without Mr. Rogers' guidance, there would be no Night of the Living Dead. And without Night of the Living Dead, there would be no zombies. We would have no zombie franchises, or TV seasons, or video games, or TV seasons, or TV seasons, or TV seasons that are just gonna go and go and go and go and go. Without the cultural impact of zombies, how do we know how to prepare for a zombie apocalypse? Which in some ways maybe helped us prepare for our current pandemic?
You guys want some Purell?
Yes.
Yeah.
In a world of unintended consequences, Mr. Rogers, who dedicated his life to educating kids and helping them overcome their own fears, may be inadvertently responsible for the greatest nightmare fuel of children of all time. Or maybe that's just Mr. Rogers' lessons coming full circle. Maybe George Romero and Mr. Rogers are just two sides of the same coin. Hear me out. In talking about his experience with Mr. Rogers in his journal, George Romero has this to say. Some short films were meant to defeat fears, to show that Mr. Rogers had to go through the same scary experiences that a 4-year-old had to go through sometimes, and that he came through it unscathed. So the 4-year-old was likely to come through it unscathed as well. Which reminds me of a G.K. Chesterton quote. I'm summarizing, but what he says is that stories and fairy tales are not meant to put fear in children, because fear is already in the world. But what fairy tales do is give them the first clear picture of the defeat of fear and the defeat of monsters. My takeaway is this: Mr. Rogers taught kids that it's okay to be afraid and how to deal with those fears. And George Romero, in his much darker, much more adult way, did the same thing. The reason that we like zombies and scary movies is because it helps us mentally prepare for the scary things in our own lives and helps us process our own fears and face them. No matter what those scary things in our lives are, lightning, global pandemics, or armies of the flesh-eating undead. Please join me next week as we go through how Cthulhian mythos and the Eldritch gods all started with Kermit the Frog. Hi-ho! Together we shall dive down into the black abyss and in the lair of the deep ones. That's not true. I just made that up. That's not a real thing. Please don't make a listicle about this. Let me know if you'd like to see more super secret origin story videos. And if you don't want to see more videos, just let me know and I guess I could text you the secret origins or send a postcard or whatever. Just let me know. And if you like it, maybe I'll make more. That's not my official sign out. I'm just